Welcome back to Truth Recon, where we shine a light on the cracks in the justice system and fight for accountability, transparency, and truth. Today's episode is one of the most disturbing and eye-opening stories out of Alabama's legal system. It's about a man named Christopher Barbour, who has spent more than 30 years on death row for a crime that new DNA evidence shows he did not commit. But this isn't just about one man. It's about how false confessions happen, how police interrogation tactics can trap the innocent, and how prosecutors will sometimes twist themselves into knots to protect convictions instead of seeking the truth. And at the heart of this story is a simple fact. DNA does not lie. People do. Systems do. But DNA is DNA. Let's go to March 20th, 1992, Montgomery, Alabama. Thelma Roberts, a 40-year-old single mother of two teenagers, is brutally murdered inside her home. She's stabbed, beaten, a plastic bag placed over her head, and her body partially burned in an attempt to destroy the evidence. Her children, who had spent the night at friends down the street, return home the next morning to discover their mother's body. Now, imagine that scene. A son and a daughter, just kids, walking into their home expecting breakfast with mom, and instead finding a nightmare that would scar them forever. The crime shocked the community. Police looked first at Robert's estranged husband. They questioned her teenage son. They investigated friends, neighbors, and even some middle school kids, but they kept coming up empty until they turned their attention to a group of homeless men living in the woods behind a local mall. One of those men was Christopher Barbour, just 22 years old, homeless, struggling after the death of his mother. Barbour was already on the radar of local police because of suspicion that he and his friends had set small fires inside grocery stores, which was a distraction to steal food. And since Robert's killer had also tried to burn her body, investigators connected dots that weren't really there. Police brought Barbour in. He thought it was about the grocery store fires. Instead, he was questioned about a gruesome murder. Now, what happened next would define his life. According to court records and his lawyers, Barbour was threatened. He was isolated. He was shown crime scene photos. He was told details about the crime that only the killer would know, details that he then repeated back in his so-called confession. He gave 3 separate confessions that night. None in the presence of an attorney. One wasn't even recorded. And this is the worst part. The others were taped after detectives let him sit on a fire truck, gave him dinner, and rehearsed his story 4 or 5 times. Now, let's think about that. Rehearsed confessions. It's not TV. This is real life. This is a real man's life. And there's a murderer on the loose. But yeah, not the truth. A script literally created under pressure. And just like that, Christopher Barbour became the prime suspect. At trial in 1994, prosecutors leaned heavily on that confession, of course. They had no DNA, no physical evidence tying Barbour to the crime scene, no witnesses to place him there. But they had his words. Words taken after hours of pressure in a fire station from a scared, homeless young man who thought he was there about grocery store fires. Of course, the jury convicted him of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. And for the next 3 decades, Alabama called him a killer. Fast forward 30 years. Science has advanced. DNA testing that didn't exist in the early 90s now gives us the power to revisit old cases. When Barbour's legal team finally secured new testing, the results were crystal clear. There was no DNA from Christopher Barbour on Thelma Roberts' body. Instead, the DNA matched another man, Tyrone Jackson, a man who lived across the street from Roberts at the time, a man already serving a life sentence for another murder. This should have been the cinematic moment of truth. The DNA says Jackson, not Barbour, released the innocent man. But unfortunately, that is not what has happened. Instead of accepting the DNA, Alabama prosecutors doubled down. The Attorney General's office argued that the DNA didn't matter. that maybe Roberts had consensual sex with Jackson, a teenager younger than her own son, on the very day she was murdered, before being raped and killed by Barbour and his homeless friends. That theory defies logic. Roberts was a church-going woman, described by family and friends as sober, not dating, not partying, yet prosecutors want us to believe she suddenly took up with the teenage neighbor and hours later just happened to be raped and murdered by unrelated homeless man. A U.S. district judge, Emily Marks, puts it, the state's version of events defies logic, common sense, and science. She wrote bluntly, DNA does not lie. Yet prosecutors still argue the conviction should stand. How does this happen? How does an innocent man confess to a crime he didn't commit? It happens more than most people realize. According to the Innocence Project, about 25% of DNA exoneration cases involve false confessions. Talked about that in yesterday's episode on interview and interrogation, and specifically talking about false confessions. Why? Here are some of the main factors. Psychological pressure. Interrogations are designed to break people down. Sleep deprivation, long hours, isolation, all can cause a person to say anything to make it stop. Again, it's exactly what we spoke about yesterday in the episode. That's why this case is exactly why I put yesterday's episode out and went through all those details so you could understand really how false confessions can happen easily. But fear and threats. Police often tell suspects, if you don't confess, you will face the death penalty. If you just admit it, maybe you will get life. And for a 22-year-old homeless man, that's pretty terrifying. Feeding details. Now, and I hate this. I hate when this happens. Detectives sometimes give suspects crime scene information and then point to it as proof they must be guilty. That's exactly what happened with Barbour. He repeated back details he had been shown. So while they're going around saying, well, he knew details that only the killer would know. Well, yeah, he knows them because you're the ones that told him those. You showed him that evidence, but then they'll use that against him. Vulnerability. Barbour was grieving his own mother's death. He was homeless, hungry, and uneducated in legal matters. Vulnerable suspects are far more likely to give false confessions. And here's the thing. Confessions are very powerful. Jurors tend to believe them even when they contradict physical evidence. This is why proper law enforcement training and interview and interrogation is so critical. The goal should never be to get a confession. The goal should be get the truth. That's what we want to get. Again, and if you go back and watch my episode from yesterday, listen to my episode from yesterday, I go over this time and time again. We don't want a confession. We should not be looking for a confession. We simply want the truth. That's all we should be looking for. Ethical interrogation means no threats, no feeding details, no marathon sessions designed to break people, and recording every second of questioning. Unfortunately, in Barbour's case, the exact opposite happened. If you're having to rehearse this, obviously it's not true. The truth, you don't have to rehearse the truth. That's common sense. But unfortunately, sometimes like this, these detectives simply wanted someone to charge. They wanted to solve this horrible murder, but they didn't care who they charged with it. They didn't care if they got the true criminal. They just needed somebody. It's very sad and ridiculous. Now, here's where it gets even more disturbing. In another Alabama case, Gregory Hunt admitted to a brutal murder, but denied the sexual assault. Prosecutors argued the opposite of what they claim in Barbour's case. They said, of course the semen belongs to Hunt, because who else would have left it there? So in one case, DNA from someone else doesn't matter. Must have been consensual. In another case, DNA not tested, well, that must belong to the killer. No other explanation. Two completely contradictory theories The only consistency, protecting convictions. That's all they were worried about. They were worried about a conviction, not getting the real criminal. Now, this isn't just about Barbour. Since 1972, 200 people have been exonerated from death row nationwide. 200. In nearly one-third of those cases, listen to what I'm saying, nearly one-third of those cases, false or misleading forensic evidence played a role. 11 involved false confessions. Alabama has had 7 death row exonerations. Florida leads with 30. The pattern is clear. Wrongful convictions are not accidents. They are the product of official misconduct, perjury, junk science, and false confessions. And when prosecutors fight against DNA testing, that should always raise a red flag, because if the truth confirms guilt, why fight it? Common sense. In 2024, Judge Marks allowed Barbour's lawsuit to move forward in federal court. Settlement talks have been attempted, but no agreement has been reached. As of today, Christopher Barbour still sits on Alabama's death row. The state continues to argue that his decades-old confession outweighs the DNA. And the real killer, Jerry Tyrone Jackson, shocking, serving time for another murder, pleads the fifth and refuses to answer any questions about Robert's case. Shocking. So what do we learn from this? First, that confessions are not the gold standard of truth that we've been led to believe. They can be coerced, manipulated, or flat out false. Second, that law enforcement training must change. Ethical, science-based interview and interrogation techniques must replace outdated pressure-based tactics. Here's the truth. There are some detectives in this country that literally get their interrogation training from TV shows and movies. It's the sad truth. I'm not making that up. Think of how crazy that sounds. That's how crazy it is. Because again, for whatever reason, they do not want to take interview and interrogation training seriously. When, as I've said, it is the most powerful tool in law enforcement. And when used incorrectly, it is detrimental to people's lives, real lives. But we still have tons of detectives in this country that are not trained at all in this. Third, that prosecutors must value truth over convictions. Protecting a bad verdict is not justice. It's obvious. That's called corruption. And finally, we learn that people like Christopher Barbour can spend their entire lives condemned to death, not because of what they did, but because of what they said under pressure and what a system was willing to ignore to secure a conviction. As Judge Marks wrote, DNA does not lie. The question is, will Alabama listen, or will they keep defending a broken conviction at all costs? Because at the end of the day, truth is not negotiable. Justice should not depend on protecting the state's pride. Let's dig into one of the darkest consequences of wrongful convictions, the ripple effect. And I spoke about this more in depth yesterday on yesterday's podcast, because this false confession doesn't stop there. Because years after police focused on the wrong man, Jackson struck again, this time in Florence, Alabama, stabbing a young mother 27 times while her baby girl slept in the next room. Here's the hard truth. If detectives in 1992 in Montgomery would have conducted a good interrogation and proper investigation instead of chasing a false confession, Monique Vaughn, Jackson's last victim, would still be alive today. This is the ripple effect of false confessions, and it's why ethical interrogation and accountability in law enforcement matter more than ever. Now, for decades, Christopher Barbour begged for DNA testing, and the state fought it. Finally, technology caught up, and a federal judge ordered new testing. And as we said, the results, no trace to Barbour. DNA belonged to Jerry Tyrone Jackson, Robert's neighbor right across the street at the time of the murder. Now, Jackson later pled the fifth when asked about Roberts in a deposition, refusing to answer more than 50 questions. But here's the kicker. Jackson wasn't just any neighbor, because as I said, years later, he would be convicted of another rape and murder. So let's move on to, let's go to October 21, 2001, Florence, Alabama. 9 years after Robert's killing, Tyrone Jackson attacked again. This time it was 24-year-old Monique Vaughn. She was found in her Shade Avenue home by her mother. Monique had been stabbed, as I said, 27 times in her chest. Her nearly 2-year-old daughter was asleep in a crib in the next room. Police found Jackson's blood in multiple rooms of the house and even on the back of Vaughn's leg. Jackson admitted he was there that night, but claimed her estranged husband attacked him and that Monique was alive when he left. Jurors didn't buy it. After 2 hours of deliberation, they convicted him of capital murder. At sentencing, Vaughn's family poured their grief into words. Her sister, April, wrote that she sometimes forgot her sister was gone and still tried to call her. Vaughn's mother described her as a loving, caring person and asked why Jackson had done this to her daughter. Vaughn's father said Jackson had taken the girl he loved all his life. Even as Jackson was led away to spend the rest of his life in prison without parole, he showed no remorse. To his family, he muttered, "This ain't over." Why? Because he'd gotten away with it completely once before. He thought he was going to get away with it again. But make no mistake, Monique Vaughn's life was over. Her baby would grow up without her mother. Her family changed forever. And here's the haunting truth. If the right man would have been arrested in 1992, if police had not coerced a false confession out of Barbour, Monique Vaughn would still be alive today. This is the ripple effect. False confession doesn't just ruin the life of the person who gave, leaves the real killer free to kill again. Think about that. While Barbour sat on death row for a crime he didn't commit, the man whose DNA was at the scene went on to stab another woman 27 times while her very young child was in the house. When police and prosecutors close their eyes to the truth, they don't just punish the innocent. They put the public in danger. That's why false confessions are so dangerous. And that's why law enforcement training and interview and interrogation has to change. You're going to hear me say that over and over and over again. Because of these types of cases, these are real people's lives at stake. Confessions should never be the goal. As I've said, the goal is the truth. The goal is justice, because the cost of getting it wrong is measured in blood and lives destroyed. So what does Alabama do with this DNA? With this evidence that points directly to Tyrone Jackson? The state's theory, or most importantly, Alabama's Attorney General Steve Marshall, who just so happens to be running for U.S. Senate, is this: maybe Roberts had consensual sex with Jackson that same day, and then hours later, Barbour and his homeless friends raped and killed her. That's probably what happened. Never mind that Roberts was a church-going 40-year-old woman who wasn't dating. Never mind that no one testified to her having a relationship with Jackson, a teenager younger than her own son. Never mind that the only physical evidence at the scene, the semen in Robert's rape kit, belonged to Jackson. Steve Marshall, as I said, who's running for U.S. Senate, is still right now fighting to keep Barbour in prison. He is defending a confession that federal judge Emily Mark said defies logic, common sense, and science. That's the system in Alabama today, protecting bad convictions even when the cost is a second murder, even when the truth is in black and white. The DNA does not lie. So let's be clear here what Steve Marshall is actually trying to do. As he pushes to keep Barbour locked up, he's positioning himself in the public eye as tough on crime and protective of convictions. That's what he's worried about. He is worried about his Senate race. He's not worried about this false confession. He's not worried about an innocent man literally sitting on death row right now. He's not worried about Jackson's last victim, who should have never been a victim if the police would have conducted a right and thorough investigation. Now, here's the lesson that we cannot ignore from these cases. If detectives would have done their job in 1992 instead of forcing a confession, instead of focusing and worried and just wanting a confession instead of the truth, 2 lives would have been saved. Emma Roberts would have justice. Christopher Barbour would not be sitting on death row, and Monique Vaughn would still be alive raising her daughter. That's the ripple effect of false confessions. It destroys one life immediately, and it opens the door for more destruction down the line. This is why ethical and good expert interrogation training is not optional. It's life and death. It's why prosecutors must value truth over convictions. And it's why voters must hold leaders like Steve Marshall accountable when they cling to a false narrative to protect their own careers. Because at the end of the day, protecting bad convictions doesn't just ruin the innocent. It kills again. This has been Truth Recon, and I'm Agent D. Baker. Share this story, demand accountability, because no one is forgotten, and justice matters. We have to make it absolute mandatory for any detective conducting any interrogation to have required expert training in interview and interrogation. We have to. As I said in yesterday's episode, there are hundreds more cases like this. Think about that. While a lot of detectives around this country, still the only training they have in this is from watching TV and movies, has to be fixed.